my name is Tahsa Goodwin. I work as a detention deputy, so I decided to do my research project on overcrowding issues in jails. Some of the questions I'd like to address in my presentation are: how has the population of jails gotten to this point? What policies have counties tried to counteract the growing jail population? And is there any evidence-based research that can assist administrators in implementing new methods to population control? In the same period that the U.S. population has grown 2.8 times, its inmate population has grown by 20. The incarceration rate climbed from 221 to 276 people per 100,000 from the year 1980 to 2008. Over the past several decades, incarceration rates in the United States have increased by more than 200%. The number of people incarcerated in the United States has surpassed 2 million. So, what has caused this increase? The most likely culprit are punitive policies, such as the war on drugs of the 1980s, three strikes laws, truth in sentencing methods, and mandatory minimum sentences. So why is overcrowding an issue? Jay Ross wrote an article entitled, "Why a Jail or Prison Sentence is Increasingly Like a Death Sentence." Ross describes that issues in overcrowded jails can lead to more in-custody deaths. Some of the issues we experience in overcrowded jails are poor medical care, high levels of violence and rape, unsanitary living conditions. For example, it isn't unusual to see 15 or more inmates sharing one toilet and shower each day. There are an increased number of people with chronic diseases living within a close proximity to each other. The typical jail is dirty, has poor ventilation, and these issues, added overcrowding, makes the problems more exaggerated. There's also been studies that show negative psychological reactions associated with overcrowding. There are increased illness complaints and other medical-related issues. There's evidence of increased suicides and psychiatric commitments, more disciplinary infractions, and more violent, as well as deaths of natural causes. In McCain's dormitory study, students exhibit the same psychological and emotional issues as those seen in the jail studies. These results suggest that overcrowding is a problem, and not that these problems just stemmed from incarceration alone. I decided to focus on jails specifically because these issues are more problematic in our jails than in our prisons, because there's more lack of freedom of movement in jails. There's a limited ability to work. There are long periods of unoccupied time. There are less recreational, educational, and alternative programming in jails. Some of the alternatives to incarceration that I found evidence-based research on that I'd like to cover are early release, probation and community supervision, unconditional discharge, electronic monitoring, CAPS, mental health care, and problem-solving courts. An early release is pretty popular in prisons already, but I'd like to argue that we can implement it a lot more in jails. In a study done by Wright and Orosky, they found that the early release group was a failure group. They were more likely to recidivate than those who did their full sentences. But in looking to the situation further, they found that there are some things that we can implement that might help increase that or reduce the recidivism rate within that population. Some of those problems were that people who were released early were less prepared for reintegration. They hadn't started their reintegration programming yet because they were not having planned on being released early, so we can implement that programming immediately. Another issue that they found was that parole officers disagreed with the early release and were often trying to correct the system. There was a closer scrutiny on the inmates who were released early than those who had served their full sentences, and also educating the community can assist in community support for those who have been early released. Some of the ways that inmates in a jail can earn early release would be by successfully completing certain programming, like anger management classes, for example, by improving their education or getting their GED, by good behavior, and also giving more options for inmate worker status. Another alternative to incarceration is probation or community supervision. Technical violations make up 25% or more of those reincarcerated. Turner suggests that it would be helpful to think carefully about the responses to minor violations of parole or probation in this example, by reserving revocation to prison as a last resort. Some counties have experienced such a huge problem with probation violators increasing the population of their jails that they've even refused to accept probation violations anymore. One of those examples that I found was in Fresno, California. I found evidence that suggests that probation would be better to reduce overcrowding if they used alternative sanctions instead of using up their discretionary time to get their inmate offenders back on their feet. For example, by making them partake in a rehab program instead of sending them to jail to detox, to assist them with filling out applications if they can't hold down a job, or to give them treatment for psychological problems that might be helping them or not to cope in society normally, like having anxiety issues. They can also assist them with finding doctors that can help them get on medications. I think that probation rules should directly correspond to the risk of reoffense. By giving offenders too many rules to follow for too long of a time makes it more likely that they're going to eventually offend. So try and limit the rules and the time frame to whatever's appropriate for each specific case. Probation is a good alternative to incarceration because the defendant gets to serve a sentence in their community. They maintain family ties, they keep their job. It reduces the likelihood of recidivism due to the offender not being prepared for reintegration after a period of incarceration if they had been sentenced to incarceration instead. One of my favorite alternatives that I found that I would like to see implemented more often would be unconditional discharge. For many minor or first-time offenders, no sanction other than conviction itself may be needed to punish or deter. The shame and stigma of conviction itself would be adequate. Maybe we could just sentence them to pay fines or restitution. Electronic monitoring was specifically adapted to the relief of the problem of overcrowding. The problem with electronic monitoring that we found is that it has very poor results as far as recidivism goes. Opponents to electronic monitoring think that offenders aren't getting just desserts. I think that electronic monitoring could be really flexible if used with other programs to help the recidivism issues such as probation with electronic monitoring. An offender may watch television at his will or choose what he'll eat for lunch while subjected to home confinement under the electronic monitoring, but his privacy is hardly undisturbed. He must respond to routine phone calls or video check-ins, may have his every move tracked by an electronic device, and may be subject to random checks or visits from electronic monitoring officers or administrators. And since it is a little bit less restrictive than, say, jail time, it would be a really good option for pretrial detainees or those who can't afford to post bond. They might be given an alternative to be placed on electronic monitoring in lieu of bond, and that way we can keep an eye on them to make sure that they show up to their court dates. Another alternative would be to put caps on pretrial detainees. Federal courts have enforced a cap on the number of inmates in some prison systems, requiring the release of thousands of inmates. We've recently experienced something similar in the state of California. One law that came as a result of this was that rehabilitation programs must accompany the newly constructed beds. So if you're going to build new beds, you have to build new community programs to assist as well. Caps can be put on the number of days or the number of inmates. For example, we can only house 20 pretrial detainees. So if we want to keep one in jail, we're going to have to decide which one we're going to let out on an OR release. I think that caps would encourage more speedy trials and would encourage courts to make cases where the concerned person is in custody a priority. And I think that it would double as an incentive for good behavior, as an inmate might be likely to get chosen to be released if he's on good behavior while he's incarcerated. I think another problem with overcrowding jails is the lack of mental health care. The group that is more likely to recidivate than other groups are the mentally ill offenders. They are usually in jail in the first place because of the lack of the care in the community, and staff at the jails is not trained to deal with mentally ill people. Mentally ill people usually become more dangerous in jail because situations in the jail exaggerate the problems that they're already having to deal with. I think that increasing the options in the community for mental health care would be beneficial, as well as identifying mental health issues at intake, so the process to get them into a correct mental health facility could be started immediately. I think that people with mental issues should be redirected at the initial contact. This would be when the police officer contacts them out on the road. They should be diverted to a mental health facility instead of the jail if that's reasonable for whatever the contact was made for in the beginning. Problem-solving courts. The most popular one that we've heard about is drug courts, but I've also found research that suggests that we can have the same good results with mental health cases and sex crime cases as well by issuing them to a specific court for their problems. Problem-solving courts have been shown to reduce pretrial detention, and they speed up the process. They do experience reduced recidivism. Drug courts assist in helping participants secure housing and address medical, psychological, and other personal problems that threaten their progress. Judges in problem-solving courts usually use other alternatives in lieu of incarceration, such as verbal reprimands. They make them appear at court more often, submit to more drug tests, more treatment sessions, or they might even make them repeat prior stages of the problem-solving court stage. And one of the problems with problem-solving courts is they only show good results for those who are good candidates, who have a desire or a will to be in that program, who acknowledge that they have a problem and they want to get better. So in my conclusion, I think that we need to start by making changes where it will most impact. Recidivism, for example, is a huge problem. Pretrial detainees, and we should offer more treatment programs. I think that we should improve our risk assessment to make sure that we place the right people in the right programs where they will most likely have success. I think we should prepare offenders for reintegration right at the initial stages of incarceration instead of waiting until their out time is coming near. I think we should offer more programming, such as anger management, educational or vocational programs in the jails. This would help those with overcrowding to have more to do with their time and reduce the stress. I think that judges should have more training in the methodology of social work so that they can make informed referrals to appropriate programs for individuals who have failed at basic life skills. I think that jail administrators and judges should become really familiar with what resources their community has to offer and to expand their range of options. I think that we should be proactive when selecting alternatives to incarceration by reading the evidence-based research that these researchers have taken the time to do, to know the weaknesses of the policies and to avoid problems such as net widening from the beginning. And teamwork. I think that everybody in the whole process should be working together for a common goal. And thank you for listening, and good luck with the rest of your semester.